Today on the Perception and Action podcast, how can an ecological approach be applied to understanding and coaching rowing? A look at a few research studies. So it's time for a call to action. Hi, everyone. In this presentation, what I want to do is kind of go over the basics of taking an ecological approach to rowing. So I'm going to talk about the basics of the ecological approach and bring in some rowing research that I think fits well. So the ecological approach is a newer way to look at skill acquisition, motor learning, skill development. This is a book I wrote that kind of introduces the basic concepts and the basic ideas. What I want to do is kind of expand on that specifically to rowing today. So it's a new kind of increasingly popular way to look at skill. And the way I want to look at this, and I want to contrast this to kind of the more traditional way we have looked at skill acquisition and skill development in the past. And the way I want to look at this is starting by looking at variability. So variability, how much things change, either the differences between two elite performers, the differences the same performer every time they execute the same movement, right? So there's basically three types of variability we want to consider. The first is the variability in the performance outcome, right? So how consistently do you produce the performance outcome you want? In rowing, how consistently do you produce the top speed? How consistently are your whole crew in synchrony, right? So in basketball, how consistently do you get the ball in the hoop? So we want this to be low, right? We want consistent performance outcomes. Good. The real crux of the matter is how we get there, right? The second type of variability is movement variability. So what we're talking about here is the angles and the forces and the positions of your joints you use to produce a certain outcome, right? So when you're rowing, when you do the catch phase or shift towards the recovery phase, what is the angle of your knee? What is the angle of your elbow? How variable is that? Is that the same for every elite performer? Do they all have a 30-degree knee angle or whatever? Is it the same across strokes, right? Do you always produce the same knee angle, right? So movement variability. What we're going to see is this is the big difference between the two theories of motor learning and skill acquisition. And finally, we have variability of practice. How variable are the practice conditions? Is the person always practicing under the same restricted conditions, for example, using a rowing machine? Or are they practicing out in the wind, using different boats, different oars, etc., right? So variability of practice. What we're going to look at is a relationship between these three things, right? And the traditional approach to skill acquisition is the idea of the one correct technique, right? There's one kind of ideal rowing technique. Body positions, when to shift, when your oar should go in the water, right? And we go to a coach, the instructor, and they give us this solution, right? They teach us this ideal technique. What they do is we do this through repetition, right? So we practice the stroke over and over and over again under very restricted conditions. The coach gives us feedback and correction. No, you're extending your legs too early, right? They're usually very internally focused cues. We're talking about what your body's doing, right? And the basic assumption, right, is the assumption, I'll emphasize this a few times, is that any kind of movement variability is bad, right? So if you're on one stroke, your knee angle is this, on another stroke, your knee angle is slightly bigger, another is slightly smaller, that's bad. We don't want that, right? We want you to row like a robot, right? Your same exact body movements for the stroke, every single stroke, right? And so any movement variability is considered to be noise, right? It's essentially inconsistency, like what we expect of a novice. And what we're going to do is make you repeat it over and over and correct you over and over until you get rid of it, right? So the assumption is here, what we want, the key to the movement outcome, right? The movement outcome we want is to be fast, be in sync, be efficient with our energy level. The way that we achieve that is by having a particular technique that's repeatable, right? We have the same angle of our knees when we go on this stroke, right? And what we're going to do on Mechana in practice is we're going to have very, very low practice variability. We're going to practice under very restricted conditions, like using a machine, till you learn this technique. We're going to get you to repeat it over and over to get rid of this movement variability, which is a bad thing. So the assumption in traditional motor learning is that low outcome variability, consistently good outcomes, which is what we want, is produced by low movement variability, by having the exact same repeatable technique. And this is developed by starting, at least, in low practice variability, under conditions very restricted, the same conditions. We're going to take you out of the water because that's too chaotic and too variable. We're going to put you in very restricted conditions until you get your technique down, right? You're going to repetition, right? So this is the assumption I just said. Movement variability is unfunctional noise. We want to reduce as much as possible by having the athlete repeat the movement over and over. And I could give you lots of quotes. There's lots in my book about how important people think, right? This is John Wooden, the famous basketball coach. His quote is, the 8 laws of learning are explanation, demonstration, imitation, repetition, 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 repetition. So for a long time, we've had this belief that the key to becoming skillful is repeating the same movement. So you do the same basketball shot from the same distance, the same position, no defender, over and over and over again until you can do it exactly the same way every time. That's the goal of practice, right? That's the tradition. That has long been the traditional assumption. It still guides a lot of what we do, right? When we add variability in, right? When we add variability in, right? We make you row in rough water, or make you row in the wind, or make you row in a different boat, or with different number of team members. What we're looking for is we're looking for you to make adjustments off this ideal form, right? So we want to develop the ideal technique first, right? That's why things like in soccer, we're going to make you dribble around cones first, right? Because we want to develop the ideal dribbling technique before we put a player in front of you. You have to make adjustments. So, and this is the fit with the dominant concept in this traditional approach, the idea of the motor program. You have this stored information, you program in your head for this movement that tells every muscle what they should be doing at any moment, right? And you develop that through repetition. So the goal of variability is adjustability. We want to be able to repeat the movement, repeat the outcome by repeating the movement despite variations in our environment. Okay, and that's what we're looking for. Okay, so this is, as I said, this is the traditional view that's dominated for a long, long time, right? So what we want to do is we want to add variability later on, right? So we would never teach, this is a baseball example, right? We would never teach someone how to a novice how to either do rowing or do a baseball swing under very variable conditions, right? In rough waters or with different sized boats all the time or with really difficult pitchers, right? Because they need to learn the quote unquote fundamentals of the swing or rowing technique first. Then later on, we'll teach them how to make adjustments, right? For, different conditions. Like think about golf. You spend hours and hours practicing on a flat ground, and then we'll teach you how to hit on a downhill. The adjustments you have to make to hit on a downhill or an uphill or the sand, etc. Right. So as I said, this is the traditional view. One of the things we're going to do when we have a novice, to make things simpler, we're going to decompose the task. What we're going to do is we're going to take the skill out of the actual competition context. So we can take the rowing and take it out of the water and put it on a machine, right? Because what we want you to do is learn the fundamentals of the movement. What we're doing here really is we're separating perception and action, right? So you perceive information about the water, about the conditions, about the other boats. That's all gone, right? Here, we're just focusing on the technique, okay? So that's kind of the basic approach we use, right? So that's, as I said, the traditional. Hopefully it sounds fairly familiar. The alternative ecological approach, right? So the alternative ecological approach started with we trace back to a Russian physiologist named Nikolai Bernstein. And the idea is that there's not one ideal technique, right? There's an ideal optimal technique for each individual that depends on their own individual, the word we're going to use is constraints, their height, their leg length, their flexibility, right? And this is going to come out through a process of self-organization, which means your body is going to find the best solution itself without the coach telling you exactly what to do. We're going to give less feedback and correction. And we're going to have this very important concept introduced by Bernstein called repetition without repetition. Bernstein, one of the first things he studied was blacksmiths. And this is a tray showing two hammer swings by a blacksmith. What you can see is they're not exactly the same. Bernstein came up with a fundamental idea is that in order to repeat an outcome, hitting the sheet metal in the same spot, getting the same synchronous rowing stroke, you can't repeat the movement because the conditions around you and inside you are always changing. When I'm fatigued, the same force on the rower, pull on the rower, is not going to cause the same outcome. So I have to change. I have to adapt. So I need variability. Without repetition, you can't reproduce the same movement. So Bernstein's view, movement variability was a good thing, right? Because it allows us to adapt to the conditions, right? Something sometimes called motor redundancy or motor abundance, right? So the ecological approach, right? In order to achieve consistent outcomes, consistent speed in the boat, synchronous between teammates, efficiency, we can't do that by doing the exact same stroke mechanics every time because the conditions are changing. The weather's changing, the wind's changing. We're getting fatigued. We're closer to the boys. We have different boats. We have different teammates, et cetera, so on. Their teammates, even if we have the same teammates, they're getting fatigued, so on. So in order to repeat the outcome, we can't repeat the exact same movement. We have to learn to adapt our movement to the conditions the constraints and conditions we're faced with. And the best way to achieve this in the ecological approach is much more variability in practice, right? So varying oar length, shape, size, boat size, weather conditions. By giving people experience, we want athletes to become adaptable. We train them to be adaptable, not robots that produce the same movement over and over that they learn through repeating it over and over, right? So the idea, low outcome movement variability requires a significant amount of movement variability to adapt to the conditions, which is developed by higher practice variability. That's the fundamental idea of the ecological approach. So movement variability is functional. It allows us to adapt to the ever-changing constraints, the things we're facing both from the outside, changes in our competition, weather, et cetera, so on, and from the inside, fatigue. Maybe we tweaked a muscle. Maybe we're sore from weightlifting the day before, right? So we constantly have to adapt. We're never performing under the same conditions twice, right? So we need to be able to adapt our movement in response to that. That's the ecological approach. So what we're considering in this, and this will be important when we'll talk a little bit about teamwork and coordination in rowing at the end. This is important because what we're going to do is consider the athlete is what's called a complex adaptive system. So the athlete they have these bunch of constraints. They have individual constraints, their body size, their weight, their level of motivation, their level of fatigue, environmental constraints, wind, weather, etc. Task constraints, how long's the course, what's the stroke rate we're going for. And from this is going to emerge a movement solution that's the best for them, right? And it's not going to be the same every time because these things are changing all the time, right? What we want in an athlete is not automatic robot-like movement patterns. We want adaptive movement patterns, right? That's kind of what we're looking for, okay? So the reason we're adding variability is we're encouraging adaptability. We're encouraging you to learn to pick up information from your environment and then adjust your movements accordingly. So we want repetition without repetition so we're learn to move. Okay. So variability, we want variability much, much earlier, right? We don't want you to learn that there's no such thing as the fundamentals, right? There's no such thing as the correct rowing technique because it depends on the situation. There's so many factors, so many constraints. We want you to learn right from the beginning to be able to adapt it. And that's the ecological approach. Okay. So instead of when we want to have a new learner and we want to simplify things, instead of decomposing it, right, taking the boat out of the water, what we want to do is simplify, right? So this is a study showing the force for different stroke rates of different skill levels, right? I think there's 3 different skill levels. You can see that as you get a higher stroke rate, it's causing a big problem for novices. So one thing we could do with novices is a lower stroke rate or a wider boat that's more controllable, right? So we're not separating the boat from the water. We're changing the other constraints to simplify it for them, make it easier for them, right? And the oar length, whatever the case might be. Let's have them in good weather conditions, right? So we still want to keep the task whole. So they're still perceiving the water, perceiving the thing around them. They're still acting according to that We're not separating that by putting them on a rowing machine. Okay? So we have information that's based on information from the water. We're keeping, the word we use is coupled. We're keeping perception and action together, right? We're not breaking them apart. Okay, so that's the basic kind of differences between the two approaches. Now, how do we put this into practice? And I want to talk about kind of two different methods and some research. One of them is called the constraints-led approach, another one called differential learning. Okay, so let's talk about how we typically correct a technical flaw as a rowing coach, right? So imagine a common technical flaw, I'm not a huge rowing expert, but this is, from what I know about rowing and a little bit, missing the catch is a very common technical flaw. So the oar not being in the correct position when you start your leg drive, right? You're not getting it fully in the water. You're not, you can do biomechanical analysis show that this is not efficient. So this is a flaw because it's not efficient. We're not transferring force effectively. Notice we're not saying it's a flaw because this angle is wrong or something like that. We have a functional reason, right? How do we typically correct that, right? So typically what we're going to do is have a coach beside you, right, giving you lots of instructions about how to correct it. Lift your hands, push your hands, get over your body, do this with your legs, right? So what we're doing is as a coach, we're giving the athlete the solution, right? We're telling them, here's what you need to do to correct this problem, right? And we're doing it through lots of explicit instruction, telling them what they need to do, and very internal. We're focusing on their body, right? In general, what is the problem with this? Okay, the first problem with this is when you refer to an athlete's body a lot, do this with your hands, do this with your legs, so on, you induce what's called an internal focus of attention, right? So I'll come back to this in a second. An internal focus of attention is when your attention is directed to the movement or the position of your body during the execution of your skill, right? Keep your feet, flex your knees, bend your wrists, so on. We're getting you to focus on the actual movement itself. The alternative, what's called an external focus of attention, is getting you to focus on the effect your movement has on the environment. Listen to the sound of the oar hitting the water, right? That's an internal focus. That's not on your body. That's the effect your movement is having on the environment, the water, right? So, and it can be the object you're holding or something more distant, right? So these are two extremes. And the article I have here's a meta-analysis this has been a very, very well-studied fact led by a person named Gabby Wolf at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, who started it and done a lot of the research showing consistently that external focus of attention is better for both learning and performance, right? When we get you to focus externally away from your body, you perform better, right? When we get you to think about all your mechanics and your technique, you become very robotic and unathletic, right? We don't want you thinking about what your knee is doing while you're in a rowing, right? That just gets you, there's tons of research showing that's less effective, okay? And there's some actual research in rowing. Here's a study looking at comparing one group that was coached. So you can see all the instructions they've got, right? Lower your hands, focus on your hands, focus, so a lot of reference to the body, legs, so on, versus look at the oar, look at the blade, focus on the blade, focus on where the boat is going, right? So those are all external instructions, getting you to focus on something in environment, right? And what they did in this study was they put two groups and they compared them and they looked at the time to a couple measures of performance time to lock and maximum reach to lock distance, right? And what they found was the endpoint consistently led to better performance, right? And that is shown in multiple sports, multiple different activities. Focusing externally leads to better performance, and they not shown in this study, better learning in the long run. So that's one of the problems with kind of the traditional way we correct technique. The other problem is that there's some good research showing that even very, very skilled performers have a very difficult time implementing technical corrections. When you say, bend your knee a little more, extend your arm a bit further, right? People don't have awareness of those things very well while they're doing their movement. and this is one of my favorite quotes from one of my colleagues from Bosch, the body shows very little interest in what the coach has to say. Okay. Our body is designed to organize itself like like a flock of birds, right? They form this pattern on their own. There's no boss telling them what to do. It's not designed to be bossed around, telling it either you or your coach saying bend a little more, right? And this is a good study looking at tennis, where they use motion tracking, and they had coaches telling tennis players, bend your knees 10 degrees more, or hit the ball 20 centimeters further in front. And what they showed in this study is even elite tennis players can't do this consistently. Right? They can't take that instruction on board and adopt it, right? They don't have that level of awareness and control over their movement to do that. They can't boss their body around while they're serving like that, okay? The other kind of problem with this is the ideal solution in correcting, right, is not addressing that thing I talked about earlier, the individual constraints, and something we talk about an ecological approach called intrinsic dynamics, which is your your preferred coordination, your body, your individual constraints, your body dimensions, how tall are you, how long is your legs relative to your arms, what's your wingspan, right? All of these things are going to change the rowing technique that's going to work best for you, right? So forcing a one-size-fits-all solution onto everybody is not going to be effective, right? An effective approach. And also, we're ignoring, right? If we're going to stand there and correct and give you the technique, no, you're extending too far. We're squashing the very important role that this functional role movement variability plays within a performer. So let's look at that. I want to show you a couple of studies that show this, right? So here's a study looking at the stroke for different going at different speeds. And this is a measure of the variability of knee and ankle angle, right? So this during different parts of the rowing cycle, what you can see is that certain parts of the rowing cycle, there's quite large, right? So there's not zero variability, right? The idea that you're producing the same stroke angle, knee and ankle angle every stroke is a myth, right? We don't do that, right? There's significant amounts of variability. There's significant differences in variability as you increase the stroke rate, right? So here's another one showing another angle, right? So there's lots of evidence for this. So these studies show there's a significant, and these were elite rowers, significant amount of stroke-to-stroke movement variability, right? You don't produce exactly the same stroke every time, even in elite rowers. There's evidence that it's functional, right? You're changing your stroke some way in order to adapt to a higher stroke rate. So you're getting better performance. You're getting that repetition without repetition we want. And there's also this evidence, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, that this could reduce injury. This actually plays a functional role in reducing injury. And why is that the case? Right? If you think about it, repeating the exact same movement with the exact same muscles, same tendons over and over and over is going to overstress your body, right? And increase the stress on your body. And there's this hypothesis by a person named James called the variability overuse injury hypothesis. Right? If we think about injury, typically we talk about two things: the amount of load and the amount and how often, right? So the frequency and load. How often do you lift? How much? And now James proposes there's a third dimension, variability, right? If we're doing it in the same way every time, we're going to increase the chance you're going to get injured too. So those variability in ankle, knee angles and things that study was showing, not only are they seem to be beneficial for performance, allowing you to maintain your stroke at higher rate, but they also seem to preserve an injury prevention mechanism and a function. I'll show you evidence of that in a second. Okay. Here's another slightly more tricky way to understand evidence of movement variability. Okay. So movement, if you think about it, if in the traditional view, any variability from stroke to stroke in your knee angle, your elbow angle, is just noise, right? It should be just random, right? So if I looked at your variability from stroke to stroke to stroke, it should be completely random, right? And the way that we can describe that in the approach to use dynamical systems, it should be what's called white noise. White noise is what you see on your TV late at night when you have all snow on your screen. It's also when you have something tuned in to a station that's not there. Shh. What that means is there's equal strength at all frequencies, right? That means that there's no pattern, observable pattern at all, right? So in this study, they did a really interesting thing. So white noise means there's equal strength at all the frequencies. So low pitch, like low sounds, and if you think about it in terms of auditory signal, low sounds are just as high as high sounds. That's why you hear shh. It's all frequencies added together. Pink noise is when there's stronger, the strength goes down as the frequency goes up, right? The amplitude. So what's showing there is that it's not just completely random. There's some pattern to the variability in the rowing stroke, right? There's some pattern as we go across it's not just noise, it's functional, right? And this is what they found in this study. So this is white noise, right, where all the frequencies are equal. This is pink noise where you're not producing the same stroke to stroke, but there's a correlation between what's going on. And this is showing these 5 rowers were lesser skilled, lower skilled. These were high skilled rowers. What you can see is high skilled rowers show evidence of this pink noise, this functional correlated variability, whereas lesser skilled ones don't, right? And I should mention, if you want to understand what pink noise and white noise, and you can learn about brown noise too, there's an episode I have on my podcast number 348 where I go in detail about that. Okay, so, but it's more evidence to show that there's movement variability, and you're not producing the same rowing stroke over and over like a robot would do. You're varying from stroke to stroke in the body angles, the positions, things like that. And it's functional, right? It's not just noise. It has a purpose, right? And we don't want to squash that. Okay. So let's get into the methods, right? So the alternative to this kind of traditional way of explicitly instructing and correcting a movement flaw is to use what's something called the constraints-led approach, right? So the constraints-led approach, what we want to do is, instead of trying to correct someone's movement solution, right, to say, okay, try pushing your hands more forward before doing this before your leg drive, or bending the knees more, or whatever it is, right? What we want to do is think about what constraint can we add to the environment or change in the environment that will push the person to find a new movement solution closer to what we want, right? So in rowing, that can be anything, right? So I don't have, there's not a lot ton of examples in the research I could find of people doing this, right? So it's changing the oar, the mast, the length, the blade, the boat, the number of crew members, the targets hanging off the boat, the stroke rate, the distance you're going to go. You can make the person pre-fatigue. You can change the environment, wind, water, right? So these are all constraints, right? Things that a person needs to adapt to. In the constraints-led approach, what we're going to do is manipulate one or more of these in a very specific way to try to change. So if you wanted to change a rowing stroke, for example, you could have a target hanging off the boat that you had to hit every time, right, before you put the oar in the water, right? What that's doing is essentially it's making your old movement solution of putting it in too early, for example, not possible anymore. You won't be able to achieve this kind of task, right? So the idea of the constraints-led approach is, can we add something that's going to push you away from what you're doing now and find something new without telling you all the details of what that new thing is, right? And in my book, we use this in baseball a lot. For example, with baseball pitchers, we have a common thing where their arm is separating from their body too early, which is kind of cause of injury. What we do is we put a ball under their arm called a connection ball, and we tell them throw so the connection ball goes forward. We don't tell them how to do that. We don't tell them anything about the new movement pattern. We've just added this constraint that kind of makes it so separating from your body too early won't work, and they have to try something new. And the fundamental idea of the constraints-led approach is what we're doing is we're giving athletes a new problem to solve, right? We're giving them a movement problem to solve. Row with this shorter oar, row with this longer oar, row with while you're fatigued, row under these conditions. We're not, and figure it out on your own. We're not, and we can, a coach, we can push it around and guide it a little, but we're not giving them the solution. We're not telling them bend your arm like this, do this. Right? That's the fundamental idea of the constraints-led approach. And there's quite a lot of research in everything from weightlifting to baseball to soccer. There's a lot of research showing the benefits of this over this explicit assumption. Okay. And this is something, right? The fundamental idea here is this idea of creating movement problems for an athlete. And they don't have to be the same as the one they're going to face in competition. So you might say to me, Rob, why would I ever want an athlete to practice rowing with a different boat or a different oar than they're going to use in their competition, right? The reason that's beneficial is because learning to adjust your movement pattern to compensate for that change in constraints is valuable, right? It makes you an adaptable athlete. It's the same thing you're going to have to do when it gets really windy out. There's a crosswind versus a headwind, right? What we're not trying in practice, we're not trying to drill into you this one movement pattern for this one oar or this one boat. We're not trying to get that. We're not trying to teach you this one motor program in your head. We're trying to teach you to be an adaptive problem solver, right? So having conditions in practice that are very different than they're going to face in competition, as long as they're chosen, as long as all of the same key things are there, the information they're picking up from the water, the basic dynamics of the rowing pattern, then that's fine. That can be very, very effective. So, for example, in baseball, I have baseball pitchers throw a heavier ball than normal, a bigger ball than normal, because the process of them learning how to control that ball is very, very valuable, even though they're never, ever going to be asked to throw a heavier or bigger ball in a game, right? The process of adapting to these new problems we're creating for them is very, very valuable. And that's the emphasis of the constraints-led approach, okay? The other thing we can do in the constraints-led approach is we can amplify information. We can make the information you're getting from the environment about the water, about your stroke, stronger, right? So you can learn to pick up, right? What you want the athlete to do, and what we'll talk about, team coordination, et cetera, is you want the athlete to learn. You want the athlete to, when they get fatigued, right, before the coach yells at them, ideally you want them to be able to recognize from the information they're getting from the environment, both the feel, the kinesthetic proprioceptive information, the sound of the water or hitting the water, that they're slowing their stroke rate down, right? You want them to pick up that on their own, be able to adapt their movement, right? Here's a couple studies that they're doing literal amplification, right? So one of the things that I talk about in this episode 350, one of the tools we really like is movement sonification, right? So can we take your movement, add a sound to it to give you more feedback about, these kind of parameters? And again, the key thing is we're letting you make adjustments and self-organize. We're not telling you what to do. So that's another kind of key component, this idea of amplifying information. For example, in sports like basketball and soccer, one of the things we use is what's called a small-sided game, right? So instead of playing on a regular soccer field, we make a super small soccer field, right? Because the information you're going to get about spacing and what happens if I do this is much amplified compared to on a big field. There's much more space. So that's the basic idea here. Okay. So that's constraints-led approach. The other approach that we use in the ecological approach is called differential learning. Differential learning is when we're going to essentially just add a lot of variability and we're going to get you to kind of experience this. The fundamental idea of differential learning is we don't want you to move the same way every time, twice. So the idea is you're going to learn about the movement space, all the possible ways you can move by experiencing all these different conditions, right? So, in differential learning, closing one eye, right? Starting with the oar starting from a different position, different size or different equipment, right? So these are the fundamental ideas. There's lots of research showing the benefits of this, right? So that's another approach you can use. So you could have a team practice with different oars, different start positions, different things, just to get that experience of kind of the different ways they can move. Okay. And as I mentioned, I just wanted to show this before getting to team coordination. This is a study looking at the potential injury benefits, right? So this was in soccer. So what they did in the study is they took soccer novices, and before it, they had them do change of direction tests. So they had to run, stop, come back. And what they were doing, they motion tracked them and they measured markers of ACL injury. So basically how what was your knee angle, what was the forces you were generating on the ground when you made the turn, right? And so they identified it, and they have clear ones they know are related to knee injury. So they measured this before training. Then what they did is they didn't train you in that change of direction test. They trained you in soccer. So what they did was they had 3 groups. One group had very, very traditional coaching where they're given instructions. So they're trying to teach the athlete to do the same thing every time, right? We're trying to teach you to dribble use the inside of your foot, do this with your leg. We want to reduce variability. Then they also had a constraints-led approach where they use small-sided games, lots of manipulation of constraints to have you adaptable, and a differential learning approach where they actually had you move differently on every execution. So these 2 are encouraging you to move in different ways. This one is not. It's squashing that. Okay. And what do they find? Then after this training, they did the change of direction test. And what they found this is looking at the force. So this is the traditional approach. The force actually got higher, right? Because you're moving in the exact same way every time. For the other 2 methods, you actually get a reduction in the ground reaction force when you're making that cut, right? Because you're learning to move in slightly different ways every time. You're learning to adapt. So you're not putting the same forces on the same body parts. So they have a few other measures, right? And they show these benefits. So one of the other benefits, along with adaptability and performance benefits of using this ecological approach where we encourage movement variability, we encourage repetition without repetition, seems to be injury prevention. Okay. The last thing I want to look at in today is where I think the ecological approach fits really well with rowing is when we talk about interpersonal coordination, right? So interpersonal coordination is when we have, a team of rowers, right? So obviously we want a big part of rowing effectively is being in synchrony, doing the same stroke at the same time, right? So one of the ways we can understand this is instead of just considering an individual athlete as a complex system, looking at the team as a complex system, right? So the team is going to they're picking up from their teammates. They're going to adapt their stroke based on the information, right? So rowing crews need to coordinate their action throughout the race and constantly adjust to each other, right? So they're picking up information about their teammates. Like I said, ideally, we don't want to wait until a coach yells like commands an athlete, oh, you're dropping behind so-and-so. What we want to do is teach our rowers to pick up on their own when they're becoming out of sync, right? By the information they're picking up from their environment, right? So, and this is very well understood by using kind of a dynamical systems approach, understanding this coordination in a phenomenon called coupling. So coupling is when my rowing stroke is linked to your rowing stroke, is linked to someone else's, right? That's what we want, right? And ecological approach gives a really nice way to understand this. And here's a really nice paper on this, Frontiers. This is by Ludovic Seifert, who's done a lot of research on ecological approach in a lot of different sports. I'm just going to briefly talk about it, but I'd recommend you have a look at it. There's a lot of great stuff in here. This is looking at both kind of coordination in rowing. Okay, so what they were going to do is they both looked at kind of what happened when coordination break down and people's perceptions of what was going on, which I'm not going to go into a ton, but I just want to show you some of the highlights, right? So this is a measure from dynamical systems theory, ecological dynamics, called relative phase, right? So phase refers to, right? So, as I'm propulsing and recovering, so if you can divide a rowing stroke into different parts, where am I relative to you, right? So if you start your stroke and I'm your teammate and I start your stroke slightly after you, I would be slightly out of phase, right? I'd be a little bit behind you in the stroke. I did everything else the same. We can measure that stroke, that difference in terms of an angle, right? So 180 degrees out of phase would be, I'd be doing the propulsion phase when you are doing the recovery phase. So it would be, which we don't want, obviously. That's exactly the opposite. Well, this is showing through the rowing cycle duration. This is showing an international level team. You can see their incredible relative phase is almost around 0 the whole time. Okay, so they're doing a great job of staying in phase. So they're doing the same strokes at the same time, parts of the stroke at the same time. This is a national level team. You can see much less effective, right? They're getting out of phase a lot, okay? And they showed this. This is a measure called the Cauchy Index, which is a measure of being in phase and out of phase. And this was a 2-person crew. This is you can look at both an individual level and a team level, right? So this is the kind of, basically you can think of the correlation between 2 successive strokes, right? So if it's high, it means they're not correlated. It means you've changed something dramatically. And what you can see, the black is the bow rower, right? And the gray is the stroke, the other person on the crew. And what you can see is you can see some reactions from the stroke rower, right, in response to changes. So even though there's good relative phase, right, and this is again the international crew, you can see there's not very big differences. This is a national crew, you can see very large differences so the person, as the lead rower is getting fatigued, the water's changing, right, they're getting changing their rowing stroke, and a good teammate will adjust to that, right, without having to being told, right? So this coordination, being able to adapt to your environment individually, is also going to help you to be able to adapt to your environment as a teammate, because you're focusing on picking up information from your environment, whether it's sound, kinesthetic, whatever, to be able to make adjustments, right? So it's all about this adaptability, right? So this is, as I said, is a really interesting paper. I would recommend having a look. Okay. So to kind of end off, I want to talk about, so I've talked about this kind of different view of skill, this ecological approach. I want to leave you kind of some take-home messages. How do you bring this into your own practice as a coach? Okay. So the first kind of principle, and this is not unique to the ecological approach, but it's really important, is I always start with is ask why, right? So every practice session you want to be purposeful, right? Not, right, you want to have, like, what is the purpose? Is it just for fun? Is it just to make my team feel confident? Or is it really some development? You really want to develop the skill, right? What we're going to do is we're going to vary the level of challenge for those things, right? Sometimes you want it to be relatively easy, so people do everything perfectly in practice. Other times, we want things to be really hard and challenging where they're making some mistakes, because that's when you improve. And within the ecological approach, there's this nice framework we have. What we want to do essentially is think about periodizing skill training in the same way we periodize physical training. Like when you're training for a marathon, you do this, long runs, you have a recovery week, right? But what we're going to do, this is a great example of using a periodization framework in rowing and paddling, actually. You can see, I won't go into all the details, but I think it's a great paper showing how you can make the appropriate time to add a lot of variability, to add a lot of challenge. Okay. What we want to do is how can we make practice activities more race-like, right? Having, if I lose synchrony or I get fatigued, what happens, right? On a rowing machine, nothing, right? Have consequences for action, have the athlete make decisions, right? That's important. Add variability to practice conditions. This is the biggest thing, I think, hopefully take home message. Variability in practice conditions is good, right? You obviously have to do it cautiously with a new person, but changing the type of oar, the type of boat, the type of conditions, the length of your rowing, the stroke rate is valuable because it's giving the athlete new problems to solve. So we want to present athletes with new problems to solve. We want to step in with instructions. Actually, instruction is probably the wrong way. We're going to step in with a little guidance, right? So why don't you try doing this, right? But we want to do much less of that than we do traditionally. We don't want to be constantly talking to the athlete. I actually do, in some of the practice I do, I turn music up really loud, right? So coaches can't talk as much. If they want to say something, they have to make a huge effort and go right up to them, because I don't want them constantly being correcting and telling the athlete what to do. I want the athlete to figure it out on their own. We want to create an environment as a coach where it's okay and expected that the athlete's going to be challenged and they're going to fail sometimes. That's when we learn, when we fail. If we do everything right and perfectly in practice, that's performing, not learning, right? We need to have at least some of our practices where we're failing. and let the athlete find their own movement solution. Within a certain bandwidth. Like obviously, as a coach, what's going to work as a rower, right? That there's certain kind of non-negotiables that you have to hit. But within that and between those, there's a lot of room for people to do their own individual style and variation, and that works best for them based on their own body, their own individual constraints. So I think that's really, really important. Okay, so that's it for today, kind of what I want to say. So this is kind of my shameless promotion to end on. So as I said, if you want to learn kind of the really basics about what this approach is, where it comes from, the advantages, then I wrote this book, How We Learn to Move. I also have a podcast called the Perception Action Podcast, where I go into really deep into the weeds of skill acquisition and a lot of these kind of approaches. I review a lot of research. I interview different people and coaches in the field. So if you're interested, please check that out. You can find everything about me. If you want, you can go to perceptionaction.com is the best place. You can find all of my information. I also have a YouTube channel where I present different things and I talk about these different things. So I appreciate your time and thank you very much for listening. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including a monthly coaches meetup, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Gone through San Luis.